bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the October 28th, 2025 episode. We're recording this several days in advance of the 28th release date, and I'm actually in New Orleans at our New Market Tax Credit Conference. So I'm recording from a hotel room, so hopefully the audio and everything else works okay. Now, my guest this week is Jason Watkins. Jason's a partner of mine in our Novogradac Atlanta Metro office. Now, I often have Jason on the podcast to discuss opportunity zones, and guess what? Today is no exception. One day we'll have you back, Jason, on a non-opportunity zones episode, but not this one. Now, 2025 has been a very, very, very exciting year for the opportunity zones incentive, thanks to the passage in July, or I should say, and the signature by the president on July 4th of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which many of you watching and listening already know gave permanence to the opportunity zones incentive. Now, part of that permanence includes a transition from the first round of opportunity zones, those selected in 2018, which we colloquially refer to as OZ 1.0 zones. There will be a new round selected in 2026 of zones, which we're referring to as OZ 2.0 tracts, and those will be effective 1/1/2027. And if you want to think into the future, there will also be an OZ 3.0, but we're not going to talk about that. Now, investors, businesses, and others that are working in opportunity zones or are considering opening up businesses in opportunity zones are going to want to pay close attention to the expiring designations of the existing, the OZ 1.0 zones, as well as I want to be paying attention to the process for which the next round of zones will be designated. Now, many might be thinking to themselves who have businesses or plans to open businesses in existing zones, what do they need to do to ensure that they can raise capital for current and future businesses in those existing zones that we expect to expire in just 3 years? I also want to make sure that we talk about the status and the process for designating the next round of opportunity zones. So Jason and I will discuss these issues, as well as Jason will share some of the questions his clients are asking him with respect to this transition. In many ways, all eyes are focused on this transition from OZ 1.0 to OZ 2.0 zones. Some of the questions that Jason may address in the course of our discussion are those that he hears during the course of the Novogradac Opportunity Zones Working Group meetings. Jason, as most of our audience knows, chairs our Novogradac OZ Working Group. And during these monthly OZ Working Group meetings, we generally start with legislative and regulatory updates from our Chief Public Policy Officer, Peter Lawrence, and from Jason Watkins himself, of course, and others, including myself. We also, in the course of these working group meetings, review and discuss any recent IRS guidance pertinent to opportunity zones. We also end up discussing numerous technical issues. Oftentimes, we're discussing technical issues that have only recently been identified or unique fact patterns. During the meetings, we'll share and brainstorm solutions to such structural or operational OZ issues. Oftentimes, those discussions will lead to recommendations to Treasury, or we'll write a letter to Treasury wherein we propose Treasury issue written guidance confirming certain consensus views as to what the right public policy and statutory interpretation should be. At the Opportunity Working Group meetings, we oftentimes discuss, develop, publish recommended practices. And this podcast isn't about all the things we do in our OZ Working Group meetings, so I'll stop there. But I do encourage those of you that are not members of the Opportunity Zones Working Group to become members. And I'll include a link in today's show notes for more about joining the group. But for now, let's delve into today's discussion that's focusing on expiring OZ 1.0 zones and the process of selecting the next round of zones, OZ 2.0 zones. Jason and I have a lot to discuss. So if you're ready, let's get started. So Jason, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday.
Hey, thanks, Mike. It's always great to stop by and chat about opportunity zones. So thanks for having me back.
Well, I appreciate you coming back. I keep being afraid that if I ask you one more time that you'll say, Mike, how many times will I be on the show? I'm not the host. Because this is your fourth appearance this year, and it's your seventh appearance total. So thank you very much for joining us. Now, for our audience that may not recall, Jason's last appearance was in August, and there we did a dive into what we know about the new Opportunity Zones statute. And today's check-in is a bit more of the implementation of what we discussed in the course of that episode. I will include a link to that episode in today's show notes. It's a little bit broader, more comprehensive as to the statutory developments that we're going to include here. So I do encourage you to go back and listen and view that episode. But for those of you who haven't seen that episode yet, or any episode that you've been on, please describe some of the services you provide to Novogradac clients. And once you do that, we'll then jump into the purpose of today's podcast.
Great. Thank you. So yes, I work with investors and funds and businesses, helping them structure, manage their OZ investments. You provide a full range of consulting, compliance, audit, and tax services. As you noted, I also do lead the Opportunity Zones Working Group. So really stay on top of the OZ industry and like to share that information with my clients.
Great. Thank you for that. Now let's kind of jump into the various issues that we've identified. And within the OZ Working Group, we've identified sort of three categories of issues: those that we need immediate guidance for, and those where we need guidance regarding the transition or the designation process of 2.0 zones, and those that are more policy and wider. And our focus is submitting a letter shortly on those areas that need immediate guidance as we think about expiring zones. So please share for our audience the areas that you and the OZ Working Group thinks are areas where we need immediate guidance from Treasury with respect to existing zones.
Sure. And there are a number. The first couple I'm going to discuss here, but there's pretty much a consensus on what we believe the interpretation is, but could potentially be interpreted in a negative way for the OZ industry. So we want to make sure that those are covered. The first is in regards to there being dual OZ designations for years 27 and 28. So the original round of Opportunity Zones they maintain their designation through December 31st of 2028, but the OZ 2.0 designations go into effect on January 1st, 2027. So for this 2-year period, there are expected to be overlapping Opportunity Zone designation groups sets. However, there's a sort of potential long shot interpretation that could say that there can only be one set of designations in effect at any given time. So we would just really want to see some direct guidance from Treasury that says, no, there are two sets. And so we can sort of put that issue to bed. A similar issue with the repeal of the special rule for Puerto Rico. If you recall back in 2018, in response to Hurricane Maria devastating the island, there was standalone legislation that passed that made all of Puerto Rico's low-income communities opportunity zones. So that resulted in a very significant percentage of the census tracts in Puerto Rico being considered an opportunity zone. As part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, there's a repeal of that special rule. The repeal is effective December 31st, 2026. Now, the general consensus is that the existing opportunity zone designations in Puerto Rico will maintain that through December 31st, 2028, just like the rest of the country's OZ 1.0 tracts. But again, there's this long shot interpretation that could say that those all end on December 31st, 2026. And that special rule, we believe the special rule only applies to future designation routes. To Puerto Rico would be limited to having the same 25% of their low-income communities be designated as opportunity zones. But again, it would be great for Treasury to just sort of clear up that issue and say, yes, Puerto Rico, its existing opportunity zones are good through 2028.
And you say there's a need for media guidance, just to be clear for the audience, because businesses, if they don't know if this is true or not with absolute certainty, they won't be willing to invest capital into these zones. Is that right?
Exactly. If there's any potential that these zones could end early, then the businesses might be trying to invest in areas that will no longer have their designation. So that would be a problem.
So there's also two other major issues or considerations that the Opportunity OZ Working Group is preparing a letter to send to Treasury to make recommendations as to how to handle it. Drum roll, please. What are the other two groupings of issues?
Well, the biggest one is on legacy business eligibility. And then a second question, which has always been a question, this is going to have to be dealt with at some point, is how funds and opportunity zone businesses will meet the various compliance tests once the OZs that they're located in, once those designations expire.
And you mentioned legacy business eligibility. So let's talk about both of them, both the compliance with your various tests, because as our audience who has experience with opportunity zones know, the businesses themselves have to meet a series of tests over the course of the 10 plus period that you're seeking to get your opportunity zone benefits, namely the omission of gain on appreciation in the underlying assets that you invest in. How do you continue over the course of that period to comply with the tests if the zones have expired? That's the second issue. The first issue, I think, is sort of, in some ways, the more pressing issue, which is if I have plans to invest in a business in a zone that's going to expire and not be redesignated, because to the extent we have these overlapping zones, there'll certainly be some areas that were designated as opportunity zones that will be redesignated. And if you're in one of those zones, then you're going to be fine until the expiration of the second round. But there'll be a lot of zones where they don't get redesignated. And for those, the zone will expire. And as you mentioned, we fully expect it to expire at the end of 2028. And we want to get guidance from Treasury just to, for anyone who has some tortured interpretation, that's not the case, that won't be an interpretation that can be made. The question becomes, over the course of that period of time, how do I know what standards I have to meet for my business to qualify, knowing that the zone's going to expire on 2028? So please unpack that issue as well as describe the rule that's in the existing regulations.
Sure. I'm spending half my time, I think, talking about this with various clients and others because it's such a major potential issue. So, as we noted, the current OZs, their designation expires December 31st, 2028. So the question is, well, what happens if I'm constructing a property at the time that the OZ designation expires, which could very easily happen. Some of these projects take years to develop. So it's going to be a very common issue. More and more so as we get closer and closer to 28, it might be possible now to start and complete construction of a project, but we just don't know what's going to happen. So probably a great place to start is describing the existing safe harbor that is in the regulations.
Yes.
So it has to do with self-constructed property. And so if an opportunity zone business is self-constructing property, there's a safe harbor that says that the acquisition date for self-constructed property is the date on which manufacture, construction, or production begins. Okay, that's the rule. And then it further goes on to say that this beginning, we'll call it begun construction, we see that elsewhere, but this rule happens when physical work of a significant nature is considered to begin when the taxpayer has incurred or paid more than 10% of the total cost of the property, which sounds like that would be easy to achieve, except the kicker is that 10% doesn't include the land acquisition, and it doesn't include preliminary activities like planning and design. So it could be very possible for a business to acquire land with the intention of developing a property. They might get stuck in the planning stages for a while, or maybe it takes a while to entitle the project, longer than expected, to where all of a sudden this 2028 date is looming. And the rule for opportunity zone business property, it has to be acquired and used in an opportunity zone. If the property isn't treated as acquired until after the census tract has lost its OZ designation, what happens? Does that disqualify the opportunity zone business? And so this uncertainty is just giving people fits right now, especially as they're looking, well, what are we going to do with this project? If we've already acquired the land, we were planning to break ground in early 2027. What happens if there's a delay? What happens if there is a force majeure event, something completely out of our control that delays the vertical construction from happening for some time? This really needs to be addressed, or what we're going to see is investment really start to dry up in these zones as the loss of their designation starts to approach. It's a problem for this transition. We have a 2-year overlap. So at least there's something else you can do. There are going to be other zones that will be designated in use or available for use January 1st, 2027. But this will be a real problem in future transition periods where there won't be an overlap. We're afraid that investment will completely stop 2 years prior to the loss of OZ designation.
Although that was a good point that you made when we were preparing for the podcast, that if the issue isn't resolved in a logical, positive public policy way, then you would find investment stopping a couple of years before a zone expires. And that would mean in the future, when you don't have any overlapping zones, it would mean you have a couple of years where there's really no opportunity zone incentive because of the way in which the transition rule or the expiring zones rule works. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but this notion of 10% of costs, excluding land and soft costs, that's a safe harbor such that you're deemed to have acquired by that date. And the idea being that you acquired it by the end of 2028, such that the property itself could qualify. It is a safe harbor, but as a practical matter, it operates as the rule, because if you're not going to invest millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars in a business that fails the safe harbor, but you got to rely on some sort of general perspective of having, started that manufacturing physical construction process.
Right. And that would be a very risky endeavor indeed, that somehow you get relief.
And as I also discussed in the course of preparing for this podcast or working group meetings or the rest, is I think of it as you've got at the business side, you've got how much cost does the business have to incur, and what types of costs does the business have to incur by 2028 in order to satisfy a safe harbor. And that's for the business itself to qualify. But we also need to know and get confirmation that the opportunity fund that's investing in the business, can receive investment dollars after that 2028 cutoff if they're investing in qualifying business. So there's both ends of the flow of capital that it strikes me it's important to get guidance on. And in the letter that you're pulling together that the working group will be submitting shortly, you have a number of very good examples of situations that, from a policy perspective, should be OZ investment eligible, but aren't free of doubt. And as I mentioned, given the dollars involved, we're going to want clarification from and reach consensus from Treasury as to the different sort of interpretations. So I would encourage our audience, when the letter's available, to review that, if for no other reason, for you to help you think about issues you should be thinking about as you're approaching an expiration zones. But here we are, we're sort of cursing the darkness, but our letters to Treasury aren't going to be about cursing the darkness. They're going to be about lighting a candle. So what is the recommendation that the OZ working groups are going to propose to Treasury?
Sure. There's some really good language that's already sort of happened. And that was back with the Opportunity Zones Transparency Extension and Improvement Act, anticipated this issue. in that under that legislation, there were certain higher income census tracts that were going to lose their OZ designation, but there was interest in making sure to protect investors that had already made investments or had committed to making investments. And so there was a much, much lower threshold that needed to be crossed in order for those businesses to be able to continue and to not have their investors suffer losses. And so we're using very similar language in our recommendation, which is basically that as long as we're defining something called a qualified pre-existing trade or business, which would mean basically an opportunity fund or an opportunity zone business that has its organizational documents or fundraising documents or a working capital safe harbor plan, or has otherwise indicated that it has this intent to invest into an opportunity zone, or it has made commitments or has made actual investments. And we've sort of seen a threshold there of $250,000 or 5% of the reasonably expected development cost for a project. So the lesser of those two. And then that would essentially make it a legacy entity that would then still be able to both continue the development of the project and also for the funds that are investing into those projects to be able to continue to raise capital that would still be qualified. And it's a really important point, Mike. I mean, if you look at the overall time frame that a business can develop a property, it's up to 62 months with multiple infusions of capital coming in from a fund. And so we wouldn't want, I think, from a policy standpoint, to limit and restrict those types of longer to develop projects from being able to be considered. So I think there's a very important policy consideration here too.
I definitely think, at some level, the longer the development and construction phase, almost the more impactful the investment is. There are a lot of reasons why the recommendation should be adopted. And I do think it's quite smart to be taking existing legislation that has co-sponsors or had co-sponsors. But, members of Congress got on board with this statutory language. And it's basically taking that and saying, as part of this definition that Treasury creates a safe harbor for having acquired property in a zone, is basically saying, let's look at these. And if you meet one of these, then that meets this safe harbor in lieu of this 10% excluding land and soft costs. So hopefully it'll be received well by Treasury and we'll get guidance soon. And the critical reason for the guidance is the longer it takes to get guidance, the more clients that we and others have that'll be saying, until I get that guidance, I really can't commit to this development or that development because I don't know if I can meet the existing regulatory guidance. So any sort of interim guidance, even a notice of intent to issue guidance, would be super helpful in that front.
Very much so. Otherwise, it'll be similar to what we saw in 2018, where a lot of investors wanted to wait until something was published.
That's right. So let's turn to the other issue, which is something that more only asset managers, tax accountants, tax attorneys, and others can learn to love. And that's the fact that over the course of the 10 plus year period, you have to comply with various QOZB tests, if you will, or qualified opportunity zone business tests, as well as qualified opportunity fund tests. And those tests are related to existing zones. And then how do those tests get satisfied when the zones expire? I don't want you to go through all of this in detail. The audience can read our letter, the OZ Working Group's letter, but if you could just give an overarching description of what the letter recommends and what the OZ Working Group recommends on that.
Sure. As you noted, several of the tests that a qualified OZ business has to meet are reliant on things being located or happening in opportunity zones. And so once an opportunity zone loses its designation, then the business is no longer technically located in an opportunity zone. So then how does it meet these tests? So there's a tangible property test, gross income test. I won't go through all that. But I will say that if these tests aren't passed, the opportunity zone business fails, which means that the fund that invested into the opportunity zone business fails its test. There'd be massive penalties. Clearly, it would be a huge issue. So our recommendation is simply that for compliance testing purposes only, allow the fund and the businesses located in an opportunity zone to continue to treat that location as being located in an opportunity zone in order to satisfy these tests. We think it's a common sense fix, but it will just really clear up the problem and it wouldn't be an issue any further.
I'm sure some people think, well, of course, that must be the answer. But once again, given the dollars involved, we want confirmation that that is the answer.
Absolutely.
So let's move on and talk about, we've talked a lot about the OZ 1.0 zones, and they go through 2028. We've talked about the transitional issues about how you qualify the business, as well as how do you ensure you can keep raising capital after 2028 to finish out the development, or even if there's a need for capital for other purposes within a given business. But let's talk now about OZ 2.0 designations. And someone who reads a statute will say, well, July 1 of next year is when it really starts, and they're effective January 1 of 2027. So July 1, 2026, the process really starts if you read the statute. And then you have January 1, 2027 for the new designations to go into effect. And I've heard some suggest, well, that means I have lots of time. So you're kind of smiling. So if that's a timeline, broadly speaking, maybe talk about the reasons why you want to be thinking about this now and be very active almost immediately.
Absolutely. States, and I've talked to several actually, they are in the process of sort of determining what their criteria are going to be for making nominations. As you noted, the official nomination process where the state's governors send the list to Treasury starts July 1st, but it's already well underway. We don't know yet what the data set will be used, but presumably it'll be the American Community Survey data that's expected now, government shutdown pending, to be released on December 11th of this year. So that will be the official data set, we think, that will be likely used by Treasury to identify eligible census tracts. And then at that time, governors will be able to start really going through those and applying their own self-selected criteria for how they want to establish and nominate opportunity zones. And every state will be different, but the process is definitely well underway.
And as you've mentioned before, on our website, we have an estimate of the areas that we think under current data would be eligible for nomination, knowing that this new round of data would come out in December and that'll adjust. Some will fall in and some will fall out of their eligibility. And I think back in 2017, it was a CDFI fund that worked within Treasury to help identify the zones. Right now, the CDFI fund is obviously not working because of the government shutdown. And there's even a reduction in force notice coming out of the White House that the CDFI fund should be eliminated as of December 13th, all the employees on December 13th. So they could come back if the government shutdown ends and then lose their jobs on the 13th. That being said, there's a letter that recently went to the White House with 101, or to the Treasury with 101 Republican members of the House or the Senate saying, not to just eliminate the CDFI fund. And I mentioned that just because if the CDFI fund is expected to do this data assistance, that could slow things down. But if everything goes according to plan, then I'm sort of hearing, I'm curious if you're hearing the same thing, that Treasury could, early next year, there was some talk of into this year, that seems more fanciful with the government shutdown, but early next year, issue the final list of eligible tracts. Is that what you're hearing?
That's what I'm hearing too. I think there will be time to assemble that list using the updated criteria. It has changed from OZ 1.0 to 2.0. It's a little bit narrower, but I expect the list will be available pretty soon after the first of the year. And then that will really give governors almost 6 months to probably go a long way towards finalizing their list. So, any advocates out there that are looking at particular areas that they would like to see potentially designated should probably act now, very soon. Because
I would just say all constituents should be kind of weighing in. And we all have a group desire to select really effective zones that have great potential for investment capital and have a number of other sorts of features that make them ideal from the standpoint of the benefit to the community relative to the ability to raise capital. And there's all sorts of horror stories in the first round where, an area that you couldn't develop because it was from a national park or some other, that was basically a wasted selection.
Yeah, that's going to be key. I mean, there are going to be roughly 20 to 30%, maybe 25% fewer zones this time. So it is going to be important to make sure that really good developable census tracts are being designated as opportunity zones. States want to be able to maximize the amount of investment in their own states. And so I think they're really paying a much more of a focus. Not that they didn't attempt the first time around, I'm going to say that at all. I think just no one really understood the OZ incentive, and then all of a sudden designations had to be made. I think now lessons learned over the last 8 years are really going to lead to some very, very developable census tracts being designated this time around.
No, and I think your point that the states have to go through and decide how they're going to weigh the various factors, where you want to pick a zone that's in need and also is investable. So the combination of the need and the investability can create the greatest good across the greatest portion of the state. And there's a lot of balancing that has to be done there. So it's great that, every state has experience having done it once before. And I remember back in 2017, early 2018, wondering if any state would fail to actually select zones because you only had a very short period of time to go through and nominate and all the rest. And fortunately, every state did select zones. And now that every state's been through the process once, hopefully this will be a lot more effective in terms of zone selections and the rest.
Yeah, I think it'll be very interesting to see how the governors deal with the additional benefits that are available for rural investments this time around too. That tripled basis step up available for rural investments. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how they split the designations between urban and rural.
No, that's a great point about all the different factors to be weighing to ensure, a governor is best benefiting their residents on an equitable basis. So Jason, there is so much more I'd love to be able to discuss with you in the course of today, but there's only so much time, and I appreciate the time you've given me so far. That being said, I am looking forward to our Opportunity Zone Summit that's going to be in Las Vegas this December 3rd. That's Wednesday, December 3rd. And the summit's going to be a great opportunity for us to discuss a variety of additional issues and update on all the different issues we've talked about here, as well as the designation of the new zones. What are some of the issues or topics or subject matter that you're most excited that we're going to be covering at the summit?
Well, certainly digging into this transition guidance more. One, how are funds dealing with the expiration of OZs? How are businesses? How's fundraising going? What do they expect to see? What are they hearing from investors? It's going to be so exciting. And really just the opportunity to get to network with so many just amazing opportunities on practitioners and stakeholders and everyone across the spectrum of the OZ industry, all being in one room. And it's just a fantastic way to get to network with all these people. So I'm really looking forward to that. Great set of panels set up for the day too. So
I am as well. I will include your contact information in today's show notes. So look for a few emails, phone calls. I know you enjoy getting calls from clients, potential clients and others. Beyond calling you, please share some of the other resources that you recommend our audience turn to learn more about the issues we discussed here and other opportunity zones related matters.
Sure. I mean, first and foremost, consider joining our Opportunity Zones Working Group. Mike discussed it linked earlier, so I won't go through that again, but to really stay abreast of what's going on in the OZ industry, that's the best place to be. You can also subscribe to our OZ industry alerts just through our website, and then feel free to use our OZ mapping tools. We have now updated our OZ 1.0 map to identify census tracts that are considered rural based on the IRS Notice 2025-50 that recently came out. We also have an Opportunity Zones 2.0 mapping tool available that identifies areas that we think are likely to be eligible to be designated based on the current data. Also, you can overlay current opportunity zones over and look at what areas are likely to be considered rural. So it's a great way to start to plan ahead for some of those future potential investments you're looking at. And then just lots and lots of resources available on our aptly named Opportunity Zones Resource Center. and it's also on our website. So please check that out.
Great. Thank you, Jason. Please do stick around for our off mic section, which I'll get to in a moment. Appreciate being on the podcast. But before we get to the off mic section, I want to encourage our audience to subscribe to Tax Credit Tuesday on whatever platform or platforms you get your podcast. If you're like me, you have more than one platform for podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, please stop. Well, actually, if you're driving, don't stop. But when you can, if you're at a place where you can stop, please take a moment and like and comment on the video. If you take a moment to stop, comment on the video, like the video, it helps raise our visibility and we'd appreciate it very much. Also, every week, I encourage our audience to share the podcast with their colleagues. It is a great way to expand our viewer and listenership. It's also a great way for your colleagues to get started in certain tax incentives, as well as for those that are more experienced, keep them up to date on the many incentives we cover. We often have those who, have a certain area they practice in, other areas don't practice as much, and they'll come in and actually binge listen or binge watch certain of our podcasts in order to get up to speed on particular issues. And we do have a full archive of episodes available on our website at novoco.com. And if there's certain areas that you're looking at working in within a subsets of various tax incentives, oftentimes we have a podcast that covers that specifically. And if we don't, I'd encourage you to send an email to cpas@novoco.com and suggest we do one, because we are trying to build out our podcast to the various ways in which various tax incentives are used. So with that, we've reached our off mic section. And as regular audience members know, we use this space to give a shout out to others working in a tax credit or tax incentive community. And there's never enough gratitude shown in this world and enough kudos given to various individuals that are doing so much to help those that have much less than so many of us have. We like to use it to highlight a professional worthy of such recognition. So Jason, no pressure. Who would you like to shout out?
Yeah. We talked earlier about some of the questions that we're getting and working through these transitions. And I want to give a shout out to Alliance Strategic Development, Sean Horwitz, John Shaw, Jordan Wagner and company. They're really doing a lot of work in creating attainable, affordable housing in opportunity zones just all over the country. And we'll definitely be talking a lot about these transitions over the next couple of years.
Great. Thank you for that shout out. I echo it. So it's great to hear about opportunity zones and affordable housing. Opportunity zones have so much for housing in general, and I am a all of the above houser. I just want more housing at all levels. So I love the contribution Opportunity Zones has made to housing to date. And we'll talk more about that at our summit. And then I also like the fact that some groups are focusing more on the affordable sector as well. So that's great to hear. And I'll echo that a shout out. And Jason, thank you again for being on the podcast today. And to our audience, I'm Michael Novogradac. Thanks for listening and/or thanks for watching.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac and Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac and Company, LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services